Connaître le professeur Macswan dans le cadre d'une biographie langagière et d'une trajectoire de chercheur qu'il a composée pour notre livre avec mes collègues pour Cambridge. It was very nice to see your researcher trajectory in the Cambridge book. C'est donc vraiment à travers ce livre que je vous ai connu. Et bien sûr, à travers ce livre qui est sorti récemment, Multilingual Perspectives on Translanguaging. Very interesting.
Yeah,
So Jeff, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. It's really a privilege to be here, and I want to thank the organizer. Oh, can you hear?
Green light? I think it's okay. Yes.
No. Can you hear now? Is that? Yeah, so thank you very much, Natalie. It's really a privilege to be here, and I'm grateful to the organizers for inviting me. I would like to share some thoughts with you on plurilingualism, translanguaging and linguistic social justice. I got more acquainted with plurilingualism through the invitation to come and speak, and I've been excited very much by what I've read about it. And I'd like to sort of look at, among the many constructs that have been proposed in recent years as a way of conceptualizing multilingualism, I'd like to focus on these two and sort of look at them in a comparative and contrastive way and focus on code switching also, which has become sort of a wedge issue in our field and sort of defines the space between plurilingualism and translanguaging in many ways. So I will be focusing on language theory rather than pedagogy. It is related to our conceptual framework of multilingualism, but still distinct. So I like to sort of unpack translanguaging, and in this case, plurilingualism too, along these three dimensions. So we have a conceptual framework, which many have mentioned already. It's often credited to Francois Grosjean's work around holistic bilingualism. This is the idea that a bilingual is a unique language learner, not two monolinguals in one, and so we expect to see that differential experience with the two languages reflected in the bilingual's linguistic knowledge. And so that affects the way we think about the bilingual's linguistic competence. And then, of course, there's a pedagogical program which concerns questions about whether mixing languages rather than using traditional assumptions about language separation might be a more effective way for teaching and learning. Now, in the domain of language theory, we have a couple of different paths we can take at that point with regard to the various frameworks that have been projected and put forward. What I call early translanguaging theory, which was the theory of translanguaging that was put forward in Ofelia Garcia's excellent 2009 book, and plurilingualism as well, both accept what I call a multilingual perspective on translanguaging or on bilingualism, acknowledging the ontological status of multilingualism, acknowledging that it is both psychologically real and socially significant. Then around 2015, translanguaging took a turn, which many have called the deconstructivist turn, because it follows in the path of folks like Derrida, who used deconstruction as a postmodern method to unearth injustice and unearth and question really traditional epistemologies. And so going down that path, translanguaging rejected multilingualism as psychologically real, following under the influence of Alistair Pennycook's work. And just to sort of unpack a little more closely the differences between plurilingualism and translanguaging, I have here some quotes from some recent papers on the matter. Vallejo and Dooley say, for researchers on plurilingualism, concepts such as code switching or code mixing remain useful emic categories in the analysis of plurilingual practices. From a translanguaging perspective, given that there are no boundaries between named languages, at least as psycholinguistic entities, it can be understood that a bilingual speaker's language competence is always and at every stage complete, as opposed to the widespread definition of plurilingual competence as emergent, situated in constant evolution and change. And then finally from Garcia and Otegi, whereas plurilingualism leaves the concept of named languages intact, translanguaging recognizes that named languages are important sociocultural constructs that learners desire, but does not accept their psycholinguistic reality. So I'm going to be looking critically at these assumptions in the deconstructivist translanguaging and proposing that we sort of return to early translanguaging theory or a multilingual perspective on translanguaging or plurilingualism. Many people are not aware that translanguaging originally did not have this component. So in the early reintroduction of Ken Williams' ideas about translanguaging, we have an extensive discussion of code switching and other dimensions of language contact by Ofelia Garcia and other scholars who were promoting translanguaging at the time. It's extensively discussed without any critique, without any reluctance, both as a pedagogical strategy and as a sociolinguistic construct. Here in that same book is Ofelia making comments about code switching. Code switching often occurs spontaneously among bilingual speakers in communication with others who share their languages, far from being a sign of inadequacy or sloppy language usage or lack of knowledge. It has been shown that code switching is a sophisticated linguistic skill and a characteristic of speech of fluent bilinguals. So here we see Ofelia Garcia actually celebrating code switching and relying on it as part of the foundation of the conceptual framework that we all share. Okay, then we see the development of late translanguaging theory, again under the influence of Alistair Pennycook's work in the language policy and planning literature. So Pennycook says, a postmodern approach to language policy suggests we no longer need to maintain the pernicious myth that languages exist. And then the next year with Mocconi, the view of languages we are suggesting here has serious implications for many of the treasured icons of liberal linguistic thought. Not only do the notions of language become highly suspect, but so do many related concepts that are premised on the notion of discrete languages, such as language rights, mother tongues, multilingualism, or code switching. And then in 2015, in particular, a paper by Otegi, Garcia, and Reed really goes after code switching scholarship, saying, among other things, code switching constitutes a theoretical endorsement of the idea that what the bilingual manipulates, however masterfully, are two separate linguistic systems. Okay, so even though the focus of this discussion is on code switching, it's not just about code switching. In fact, anything that suggests that an individual bilingual has internal linguistic diversity that is structured and organized in a way that corresponds to external linguistic communities is, forbidden, so to speak, under this view. So there are lots of what we might call logical casualties. Dual language, first language and second language as a distinction is no longer possible if one accepts this view. Additional language, code meshing, language mixing, however you want to talk about it, is incoherent if we accept this view. Heritage language, and I'll say more about this later, but the idea of an emergent bilingual learner or a bilingual learner also makes no sense if we don't believe in individual bilingualism. Okay, so code switching is structured, and the structural analysis of code switching has led to important theories about bilingual grammar that started to emerge in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and has been an ongoing vigorous area of research ever since that time, so for decades. And so this is just presenting here a few examples of what we call, well-formed code switching expressions and ill-formed code switching expressions. I'll say a little more in a moment about what that means. Here's an example from Aguirre from 1976. No te vas a poner tu jacket. That's fine. Tengo un magazine nuevo. Normal, ordinary way of speaking among bilinguals. And then what scholars began to recognize is that some code switching patterns are surprisingly illicit, ill-formed. So you see, for example, this example involving a pronoun that's due to Gumpers and Hernandez Chavez. He era reglador. That's not allowed. Code switching between a subject pronoun and a verb, or code switching between an object clitic and a verb. This is an example observed by Shanna Poplack. Yo la saw, strongly ill-formed. So in case some people aren't familiar with this idea of grammaticality, it's important to define it. So I've got two examples here of sets of sentences that contrast with regard to their grammaticality in English. The first set relate to resultative clauses. John saw the red barn, perfectly natural thing to say for a monolingual English speaker. John painted the barn red, also perfectly natural, perfectly consistent with our internalized knowledge of grammar, but we wouldn't say John saw the barn red. That would register an intuition such that we would recognize that that sentence is inconsistent with our knowledge of English grammar at a subconscious level. The next set, John saw pictures of himself on Facebook. John saw Mary's pictures of him on Facebook, but not John saw Mary's pictures of himself on Facebook. We would register a negative grammaticality judgment. So just as there are negative grammaticality judgments on monolingual language, there are negative grammaticality judgments in code switching constructions, often in surprising contexts. Here's another example. This one's from Farsi and English, code switching due to Shahzad Mohoutian. Farsi puts objects before verbs. English, of course, puts objects after verbs. So you see in example number 1, that's pure Farsi, showing you the object placement before the verb. And then example number 2, English only, showing the object placement after the verb. So what happens if you mix Farsi and English in this context? Well, the language of the verb gets to determine where the object goes. So if it's a Farsi verb, the object goes in front of the verb, whether it's in English or Farsi. If it's an English verb, the object goes after the verb, whether that object is in English and Farsi. And you see those in Mohoutian's examples in number 3 and 4. And then if you violate the pattern, so in number 5, we see an English verb with a Farsi object in front of the verb. This now registers as an ill-formed result. This is a pattern that has been attested across a wide range of language pairs studied by code switching scholars in Japanese English, English Hindi, and Korean English code switching. So this and many other patterns of grammaticality, and when I say many, believe me, that's quite an understatement. Code switching has been studied across a massive range of language pairs, massive databases, using various methods of data collection, and there have been extensive findings and analysis of code switching patterns, and the goal is to understand the nature of bilingual grammar. How is grammar represented such that these grammaticality effects take place. And so what you see on this slide is sort of a historical outline of code switching research as it has progressed through the decades. And as code switching researchers have learned from one another through the decades and continue to develop, continue to put forward different proposals and analyses of code switching data. And code switching, as many of you may know, sort of proceeds into different strands of research that are complementary. One is focused on language structure, so it relates to bilingual grammar, and the other is focused on language use. And so we have work, for example, by Peter Auer, using conversational analysis to gain insight into the meaning-making potential of code switching. There have been other approaches to language use in code switching that have been developed as well. So all of this is just to sort of show you that code switching, everybody in applied linguistics and language education knows what code switching is. But unless you're really part of that particular area of research, you may not be aware of how extensive it is and how detailed and focused that work is. So that's what I'm trying to achieve here, is to share some of that broader context with you. And in the domain of the grammatical study of code switching, there have been various models proposed. Some of them have fallen out of favor, some of them are still in favor, and there are active and ongoing debates, but all of them have this property of what I call integration. So I named this in my 2017 article on multilingual perspectives on translanguaging as an integrated multilingual model. And this is the idea that there are shared components of grammar across a bilingual's linguistic knowledge, but there are also discrete components which sort of house these areas where there are conflicts, really. So if you reflect for a moment on the distinction between Farsi and English with regard to object placement, those are contradictory requirements. And so those distinctions have to be protected, so to speak, so that the grammar can function and get the right word order for Farsi and the right word order for English and the right word order for English-Farsi code switching. And so that's where these areas of discreteness come into play. And so what I'm showing you here is a very general idea. And then when we look at the actual detailed proposals, we see very concretely how this relates, for example, to phonology, syntax, morphology. How is the grammar actually organized such that it's predictive of particular patterns and structures? Okay, so this idea that emerged and continues to be the focus of code switching research is consistent with some ways of thinking about multilingualism, but not other ways. So in particular, it's very consistent with plurilingualism, with the multilingual perspective on translanguaging, and it's not consistent with the deconstructivist turn in translanguaging. So it's consistent with Vallejo and Dooley's definition of bilingualism as emergent, situated in constant evolution and change. It's consistent with the way translanguaging is presented in Ofelia Garcia's original reintroduction of the concept, where translanguaging is used as an umbrella concept that includes code switching and other dimensions of language contact. And I really like this definition of translanguaging that is put forward by Suresh Kanagaraja in his 2011 paper. Translanguaging is the ability of multilingual speakers to shuttle between languages, treating the diverse languages that form their repertoire as an integrated system. So you see here in Kanagaraja's take, there are languages, and these languages are used dynamically in combination with reliance on language as an integrated system. Integrated does not mean unitary. Also, just sort of going a little beyond this general idea, we can think of multilingualism as universal, right? We all have different ways of speaking in different contexts. Jim G refers to these as social languages. So you have a different way of talking when you're giving a lecture than you would have when you're talking with your close friends. You may speak a different register or even a different dialect when you go home to visit your family. Or you may speak in multiple languages like French and Italian and English. So all of these different systems have pockets of variation that require some sort of protection and isolation within the grammatical system. And so I enjoyed this quote by Noam Chomsky, who doesn't often have anything to say about multilingualism, but in this case he offered a comment, said every person is multiply multilingual in a more technical sense. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about whether the proposals offered by deconstructivists are empirically sound. And what you see here is a list of 4 publications that have been put forward in recent years that are essentially critiques of code switching. So all of these share these 3 characteristics as pieces of scholarship. There's no literature review. There's no data that's relevant to the question. And there's no theory. So those are significant shortcomings. It's not unusual to see an inadequate literature review, but it is quite unusual and quite unexpected to see a critique of a topic that doesn't have a single relevant citation on that topic. And that's the case of all 4 of these critiques of code switching. There's an expectation of a predictive theory being put forward. What is your theory about bilingual language such that a particular pattern of data would be expected? No such theory is presented. What data can you offer that would tell us that existing theories of bilingual grammar are inadequate or incorrect? No such data is presented. So it's really remarkable that these first of all, quite frankly and candidly, it's remarkable that they were published. But it's also very remarkable that they've been influential. And I'm not the only one to hold these views. Stephen May, and these quotes by Stephen May and Peter Auer are in publications, are in chapters in this book. Peter Auer, who's an observer rather than a direct participant in this literature on code switching, says, translanguaging theory presents a high degree of historical amnesia, or at least historical ellipsis. We see this clearly in the progression of translanguaging as a new academic paradigm via its increasing dichotomization of translanguaging and code switching. Peter Auer, if you know Peter, he's very direct. And this was his comment in his chapter in the book. The construction of translanguaging as a counter notion to code switching is based on a gross misrepresentation of research on bilingualism and code switching as it has been accumulated since the 1970s. And there's another chapter in the book by Bott and Bologna that makes similar remarks, and I have made similar remarks in my publications as well. So a recent paper I want to focus on for just a moment that we're all calling the Manifesto, because that's the subtitle of the work. You see the citation there. Introduces this concept of abyssal thinking as a way of describing the point of view of code switching scholars and others. And so this term is due to a Portuguese sociologist, Bonaventura de Sousa Santos. And here I'm going to rely on Garcia and colleagues for an understanding of abyssal thinking. They define it as thinking which creates a line establishing that which is considered civil society and declares as non-existent those colonized knowledges and lifeways positioned on the other side of the line, thus relegating them to an existential abyss. Our critique of abyssal thinking aims to unsettle European colonialism's division of populations into superior civilized races and inferior uncivilized ones, and it aims to challenge, too, the insidious legacies of these colonial logics in the contemporary world. And then for discreteness, they offer some data to sort of explicate and illustrate the concept of abyssal thinking, and in sort of describing or drawing conclusions and observations about the data, they make the following comment. These two vignettes demonstrate how racialized bilingual students are continuously positioned by society and categorized in schools as deficient in language, despite the students' own understandings about their linguistic abilities. So this is essentially a way of talking about deficit thinking and deficit ideology that has been discussed by others with slightly different conceptual tools. I've listed some of them there on the slide. So it's really a deficit orientation that is specifically focused on race. So I suppose it's a lot like ratiolinguistics in that regard. So I want to focus on this paragraph in the manifesto that really puts forward three different claims about code switching in particular. Many scholars of bilingualism have long insisted that this behavior, code switching, is rule-governed. However, very early on, racialized bilingual scholars argued that the proposed orderliness and constraints on code switching did not correspond to their observations of practices in the community. For example, Pedro Pedraza and colleagues argued that they did not find such constraints. So you see in the discourse a contrast between many scholars of bilingualism, and then the examples are Poplack and Macswan, who are white scholars. And I was not around in 1980, well, I was in high school in 1980 when Shanna Poplack did her terrific work. But Shanna Poplack as a white scholar is being sort of contrasted and separated or distinguished from the bilingual scholars who are said to have objected to the code switching research, and in particular the idea that code switching revealed orderliness and order and constraints of the nature that I previously showed you. So even though it's kind of presented as a prevalent concern, only one example, only one citation is offered, and that of Pedraza. So this paper by Pedraza is actually well known. I didn't have a copy. I had to go to the Chicano Studies Library at UC Santa Barbara and dig through the stacks, and I found it because I wanted to read it. I scanned it. I made it available, so there's a QR code there if you would like to download it and read it for yourself. This paper says absolutely no such thing. Absolutely no such thing. There is extensive citation of the code switching literature, but not for a moment do these folks criticize or question the research being done by Poplack and her colleagues. Here you see an example, a string of citations to contemporaneous research on code switching, including research by Guadalupe Valdez, who was publishing under a different name at that time. Here, another excerpt. The linguistic analysis of code switching recorded in the natural setting has shown that claims of language debasement are unfounded. On the contrary, for most of the community, code switching serves to expand their communicative and expressive needs and not restrict communication or cause a breakdown. In no case is the grammaticality of the constituent languages compromised. So they were concerned with diglossia, and whether code switching had a deleterious effect on language maintenance of Spanish and English in the community they studied. They really were not looking specifically at code switching, although code switching was related to their concerns. But the summary presented in the manifesto is completely incorrect. And the other claim that's presented in that small paragraph I summarized, more implicit, is that code switching is the work of primarily patronizing white scholars who are telling communities of color what their language is like against their vehement protests. But in fact, code switching is a broad collaboration between scholars of color, and certainly there are white scholars involved as well. But it has actually been a fruitful domain of research and an opportunity for minoritized and racialized bilinguals to study their own linguistic communities, and many of them have and have produced very impressive work. And in that regard, it's just like the study of African American language, where you have a collaboration between folks like Bill Above, Guy Bailey, Walt Wolfman, who are white scholars, who have collaborated with folks like Geneva Smitherman, John Baugh, John Rickford, Shanika Hankerson, many other scholars of color, to provide really wonderful insight into the nature of stigmatized language. And in both domains of work, both in African American language and in code switching, the desired effect was to clarify that these languages, these ways of speaking, are not, errant. They're not deviant in some way, but they're rule governed. They follow in a predictable they follow a predictable set of patterns and language behaviors. So that claim that is implicit in the manifesto is also quite false. And then, of course, the idea that code switching is not structured is really absurd. It's really absurd. And when you reflect for a moment on the volumes of research in this domain that have documented patterns of code switching, not only between racialized language, not only the code switching patterns of racialized speakers, but also between other languages where you may not have racialized individuals involved. It is such a massive body of work, and it relates to all structural domains of analysis. Syntax, I've illustrated that with just a couple of examples in earlier slides, but also morphology and phonology, right? It's quite evident. It's a very, very strong result. And not only has it been documented through, sort of observation, but it's also been studied to determine whether the grammaticality judgments that people get on code switching are reliable. And it's been found that they are statistically reliable, even in contexts where people have negative attitudes about their own code switching. So it's a very, very strong empirical result. And I do want to point out that although code switching is a racially and linguistically diverse field of work, the primary influencers on the deconstructivists are white scholars, right? Alistair Pennycook and Portuguese sociologist Bonaventura de Sousa Santos. So these three claims that are explicit or implicit in the manifesto are completely wrong and extend into new terrain, these distortions of the code switching literature. And it's really quite unfortunate in my opinion. So I want to turn now, so what I've tried to establish for you is that this idea that there's no psychological reality to bilingualism has no empirical basis whatsoever. It did not emerge from empirical or linguistic research on language. It is an ideological assumption that was put forward by Alistair Pennycook in particular, who operates as a postmodern ideologue. He's not really engaged in much empirical work. So that's one aspect. But as we know, there's a lot of concern, and good concern, as there should be, about linguistic social justice as it relates to multilingualism. And very often people think of translanguaging, and I think plurilingualism too, as related to these concerns. And I want to try to share what I think are the negative consequences of deconstructivism for language policy. Now, the deconstructivists try to narrow the scope of Pennycook's view that multilingualism doesn't exist to just the individual level. So some of what I'm saying relates in a more focused way to Pennycook's claim, and I'm going to give you some other examples in a moment that relate to individual bilingualism. But when we think about community level bilingualism in the context of Pennycook's original idea, Pennycook was concerned about colonialism. The idea was, languages, Spanish, French, Portuguese, these are colonial entities, and they're going around naming languages. This is colonial activity. And we should just give up and forget about these language names because they reify colonialism. Well, not always. Language naming can be a way of reclaiming your linguistic identity. And in a beautiful paper by Nicholas and McCarty, also in this book, they show that in Hopi language revitalization, language naming is critically important to that community. And it is an act of decolonization, right? And when you think about asserting names of other languages like Black English, Chicano English, these are acts of resistance. These are acts which project a linguistic identity that is at odds with oppressive languages that surround them. So that's one thing. And then just to give a couple of other quick examples of the way in which multilingualism is quite important, also as a reflection of the individual identities of language speakers, there's this wonderful work by John Baugh and his colleagues on linguistic profiling. So what these folks did is John Baugh, when he went to work as a professor at Stanford, he's a black man, and he started calling to find an apartment to rent. And he would use, his academic English, and he was told by the landlord, yes, that apartment's available, please come see it. When he showed up, they said, it's been rented. It's been rented, it's not available anymore. So this led him to this study idea. And so he would call various landlords and properties for rent using three different varieties, which he spoke quite well: African American English, Standard English, and Chicano English. And he would call repeatedly the same properties. And when he called using a minoritized variety, the properties tended to no longer be available. And so his language, his projection of identity through language was used as a proxy for racism. And this led to terrific legal protections in housing in the United States, making it illegal to, sort of intensifying protections for people who were looking for housing who might be in some protected category. And John has served as an expert witness in legal cases and so on. So if we think about, if we begin with the assumption that language doesn't exist, and language communities don't exist, then we're in deep trouble when we also want to think about language as a proxy for racism, right? There's no law prohibiting a negative reaction to the sound of a person's voice. But in the US, there is a law against using a person's accent as a proxy for racism. We also can't really advocate effectively for bilingual education if we don't acknowledge the existence of bilingualism. But let me turn just briefly, and I'm aware of the time, so I want to try to wrap up here so we can have some comments and discussion. The focus in translanguaging in Ofelia Garcia's work is on individual bilingualism. And so in the United States, there's a very important Supreme Court case called Lau v. Nichols that makes it against the law for schools to turn away folks who don't speak English. It happened in the 1970s when a Chinese family showed up to a San Francisco school and they were told, you know, we don't know how to teach you English, get out of here and come back when you speak English. And so the courts decided, thankfully, that that's completely illegal, and furthermore said that schools cannot ignore the fact that children don't speak English. They have to address that in some way or another, because if a child doesn't know English, that child cannot meaningfully participate in schooling. So that is a construct of individual bilingualism. This is the idea that some children are developing knowledge of English. And we have to be able to talk about, if we're going to protect their civil rights and their access to education, we have to be able to talk about their progression and development as second language learners. And I think this problem also emerges in the term emergent bilingual, which is due to Ofelia Garcia. It's a very nice term because it focuses on the strengths of learners. We used to call students like this, and many people still do, English learners, right, which focuses on what they don't know. And now we want to call them multilingual learners or bilingual learners. And if we call them emergent bilingual learners, it conveys the idea that they're still developing their language ability. And so that is an acknowledgement of bilingualism, and it's critically important. And if we want to be consistent, you know, we can't deny that individual bilingualism exists and continue to use terms like emergent bilingual. In the language planning and policy literature, this debate has been sort of going on independently for a while. Colin Phillips and Skutnap Kangas remark on it in this 2017 paper, with reference in particular to folks like Pennycook. They say some scholars working in the area of language policy with postmodernist leanings have challenged even the basic concept of language, whereas in national and international law, the concept is self-evident and problem-free. The challenge this presents for advocacy is obvious. In legal documents on language rights, these rights cannot be attached to non-existent entities. So just to conclude, you know, we all love the conceptual framework, and we're all on board with the pedagogical research program across, I think, all domains of language education research. But in my view, this idea that multilingualism is socially significant and psychologically real is critically important, and it's necessary if we want to be consistent with the empirical research. So with regard to plurilingualism and translanguaging, I think it would be really wonderful to spend a little more time as scholars developing plurilingualism as an alternative to translanguaging, because it allows us, it gives us access to consistency with the empirical literature, and it gives us access to, I think, a better way of conceptualizing multilingualism. So this is the book, and there's a discount code if you want to buy it. It's MPT40, gives you a 40% discount. I tried to get a 60%, but they wouldn't do it. So I encourage you to buy it. I do want to say in closing that it pains me to have to speak so candidly about these issues, particularly in front of my good friend Li Wei, who I've known for 25 years, who I admire, respect, and like. But I think it's important for us to be candid. And so that's what I've tried to do today. Thank you.
Thank you for your beautiful conference. It was very enlightening.
Thank you.
Alors maintenant, Georges-Daniel Veronique va venir donner sa réponse, discuter avec Jeff. Macswan.
Oui, alors je vais parler en français et je vais commencer par remercier Jeff Macswan pour sa présentation extrêmement décapante et intéressante. Et je voudrais aussi bien sûr remercier les organisateurs de m'avoir confié cette tâche. Alors, c'est une brève intervention évidemment, et c'est une intervention qui est, je dirais, qui converge tout à fait avec les thèses exposées par Jeff. Donc, ça sera en 3 parties. Une première partie qui sera justement de montrer quelques points de convergence. C'est-à-dire que je voudrais faire 2 choses à la fois, en fait, montrer les convergences et montrer également ce qui est aussi propre à la scène française, parce que dans le fond, nous avons vécu pendant très longtemps sans la notion de translinguistique, vous avez compris, et nous avons fait autrement. Hein. Et donc, bien sûr, dans la période récente, un certain nombre de nos collègues ont fait du translangage, etc. Mais je pense qu'on peut faire autrement, et c'est un peu le message que Jeff a présenté à l'instant. Donc, mon premier point sera ce point sur la convergence. Mon second point sera d'essayer de, très rapidement, bien entendu, de présenter un peu les alternatives françaises, pourrait-on dire. Et enfin, je terminerai par quelques questions qui sont, le terme anglais est assez satisfaisant, pending issues, qui sont donc un peu pendantes, en quelque sorte. Et mon propos sera de montrer, en fait, que les choses sont un peu plus compliquées. Alors, pour comprendre pourquoi les choses sont un peu plus compliquées, je dis 2 mots de moi-même, non pas que je veuille faire de la pub pour moi, mais simplement c'est pour comprendre d'où je parle. J'ai travaillé sur l'acquisition du français par des travailleurs étrangers, et c'est important de dire travail étranger, marocain en l'occurrence. J'ai travaillé sur les sociétés créoles, donc ça peut faire référence aussi aux questions de racisation, qui sont des questions qui sont en train d'arriver dans la scène française, qui n'y sont pas tout à fait, mais on verra que c'est un peu compliqué. Et enfin, j'ai travaillé un peu sur des questions qui sont tout à fait urgentes en FLE, qui sont des questions, en français langue étrangère, des questions autour des curricula dans des sociétés postcoloniales. C'était d'ailleurs le sens de ma présentation, où j'ai parlé du cas de Maurice, qui est un cas extrêmement passionnant dont je ne parlerai pas ici. Alors effectivement, j'ai bien apprécié le travail en 3 parties, pourrait-on dire, les trois points sur lesquels Jeff a organisé son propos, c'est-à-dire une conception du bilinguisme, le bilinguisme dans sa perspective pédagogique. Alors moi, je pencherai davantage sur l'aspect pédagogique qu'ici, que dans la présentation de tout à l'heure, et enfin la question, disons, de l'écologie de ce qui est engagé par la notion de bilinguisme. Et je vais donc, sur ce premier point de la convergence, en fait, je suis assez d'accord avec les thèses de Jeff Macswan, simplement donner un petit éclairage de ce qu'on a pu faire dans le domaine francophone, sur 2 points, je dirais. Une des différences qui me paraît remarquable dans les travaux conduits en langue française, pas forcément par des Français, et par rapport à des travaux en langue anglaise, c'est effectivement le travail sur les représentations linguistiques et sur le développement de la conscience métalinguistique. Hein, ça s'est beaucoup vu, alors je ne vais pas tout citer, mais dans les travaux sur le Val d'Aoste, sur Andorre, et évidemment par l'immense travail, pourrait-on dire, de Candelier. L'autre chose qui me paraît aussi en débat du point de vue pédagogique, c'est la question et j'y reviendrai, Daniel Kos y est beaucoup consacré, sur la question du code switching dans la classe dans des classes qui ne seraient pas juste une juxtaposition de langues, mais des langues mélangées. C'est la question de l'efficience ou de l'efficacité de ce code switching en termes pédagogiques. Pour ma part, je ne suis pas tout à fait convaincu de cela, mais évidemment, c'est une matière à discussion. Alors, mon deuxième point, ça va être justement de montrer comment nous avons fait en langue française, pourrait-on dire, en n'ayant pas travaillé, en n'ayant pas à notre disposition, évidemment, il y a 10 ou 15 ans, la notion de translinguistique, translangage. Bon. Alors, évidemment, je dirais, dans le monde francophone, tout commence par une critique de Saussure, et donc, moi, il faut, paraît-il, donc je retiens 3 perspectives qui sont très intéressantes à mon avis. La perspective qui a été... J'y associe le nom de Josiane Boutet, et je pense que c'est la principale promotrice de l'idée que, à la place de penser en termes de langue, on pourrait penser en termes de pratiques langagières, et donc aussi de pratiques langagières bilingues, trilingues, etc. Le travail qui a été proposé, j'y reviendrai, par Daniel Cosse autour de compétences plurilingues, répertoire plurilingue, et enfin un travail qui vient du domaine de la créolistique, qui est le travail qu'a proposé il y a fort longtemps déjà Lambert Félix Prudent autour de la notion d'interlect, qui, je le dis comme ça rapidement, en faisant écho à ce qui a été dit, qui est un travail qui a été proposé par quelqu'un qui se définissait comme un linguiste natif, parlant lui-même le créole, ça veut dire, en l'occurrence le créole martiniquais, et qui, par ailleurs, refusait absolument, justement, la notion dont Macswan a pu montrer qu'elle était cruciale pour notre réflexion, refusant la notion que le code switching est régulé. Et donc développant la notion d'interlect. Cette notion d'interlect a des conséquences assez importantes en sociolinguistique française, parce que c'est de là que découle tout un courant de travaux en sociolinguistique autour de l'alterlinguistique, que l'on pourrait associer à un autre créolophone, Didier de Robillard, et Didier de Robillard lui-même développant d'ailleurs aussi une sociolinguistique phénoménologique et herméneutique. Donc nous ne sommes pas très loin de ces deux déconstructions inspirées par Heidegger. Un autre travail dans la perspective linguistique, pourrait-on dire, c'est le travail qui a été amené à travers les travaux sur l'acquisition des langues par des gens comme Rémi Porquier, et Bernard Pie, le travail sur l'exolinguisme et le bilinguisme. Donc je vais dire un mot sans être trop long. Je pars sous le contrôle de Nathalie qui doit me contrôler. Et enfin, le travail, évidemment, sur lequel je reviendrai plus longuement tout à l'heure, sur le plurilinguisme. Donc, je dirais, j'ai quelques citations, je vais glisser rapidement. Pour illustrer cela, j'ai mis une citation ici que je n'ai pas traduite parce qu'elle est trop longue, de Boutet, mais simplement l'idée générale, comme vous le voyez, c'est que Josiane Boutet a développé l'idée que plutôt que de travailler en termes de système linguistique, il est bien de travailler en termes d'activités linguistiques qui définissent des situations linguistiques et qui, en retour, sont influencées par la situation linguistique. C'est un beau programme. Je dois dire qu'à mes yeux, ce programme n'a jamais été rempli au sens où, à la suite de cette thèse, sauf chez Josiane Boutet peut-être, on ait pu voir de belles descriptions, dégageant par exemple une grammaire des pratiques langagières. Je n'ai pas vu cela, mais je suis peut-être un peu aveugle ou pas très clairvoyant. Bon, le travail sur le répertoire multilingue et le plurilinguisme, sur le répertoire plurilingue, c'est le travail qu'a développé, je dirais principalement de ce courant Daniel Cosse, que vous pourrez lire, qui a écrit abondamment sur cette question. J'ai pris une petite citation d'un article qui me paraît important dans sa production, qui est un article de 2001. Et enfin, le troisième courant, pour aller vite, c'est le courant donc de l'interlect. La notion d'interlect, telle qu'il est employé par Prudent, c'est de dire l'alternance entre le français et le créole est strictement imprévisible. C'est une idée que je ne partage pas. Mais s'il devait être prévu, c'est exactement le raisonnement qui a été exposé tout à l'heure. ce serait plutôt une vision, peut-être, on va dire, non pas de blanc, mais de linguistes non natifs, par rapport à des linguistes natifs. Bien, alors, et ceci a donné ensuite, je ne développerai pas du tout, le courant de l'interlinguistique, l'intersociolinguistique et de l'interdidactique, représenté par notre collègue Castellotti. 2017 et non pas 21. Je dis un mot rapidement des travaux qui aussi sont au courant de réflexion, comme toujours pour répondre à la question comment on a fait sans le translinguistique. L'idée de communication exolingue, qui est une notion que Rémi Borquier a développée à partir des communications entre natifs et non natifs lors de l'apprentissage d'une langue étrangère, et la question du... Et Bernard Pie lui a fait, lui, avec Porquier d'ailleurs, le lien entre les travaux, les activités des bilingues et les activités des natifs, non natifs, parlant une langue dont les uns maîtrisent bien et les autres un peu moins bien. Bon, et enfin, il y a ces travaux importants qui sont des travaux peut-être un peu didactiques, si on veut, enfin qui sont didactiques, pas un peu didactiques. Le courant didactique a été fortement développé en France, de didactique de la pluralité des langues dans différentes directions. J'en ai cité quelques-uns simplement, et j'ajouterai par rapport à l'exposé que nous avons entendu qu'il me semble qu'en France, on a tendance à juste titre, à mon avis, à distinguer clairement le plurilinguisme qui serait plutôt le fait du locuteur individuel, du multilinguisme qui serait plutôt un fait sociétal. Hein. Et je crois que c'est une distinction qui est utile de faire. Alors, dans les courants de la didactique du plurilinguisme, qui sont connus certainement de cet auditoire mieux que moi encore, je voudrais pointer la direction sur le travail lié à l'accent mis sur la représentation linguistique, sur l'éveil au langage, hein, les travaux autour de Candelier et de bien d'autres. Candelier 2003 résume tout cela. Le travail sur le code switching et le code mixing, je cite en passant Daniel Moore sur les bouées transcodiques, et enfin, et je veux dire que les promoteurs de ces idées ont aussi beaucoup insisté, un peu comme dans ce qui a été rapporté à l'instant, sur les déplacements qu'une didactique de la pluralité introduisait par rapport à une didactique plus unitaire. Et c'est une question qui se pose effectivement aux fabricants de curriculum, qui est de savoir est-ce qu'on enseigne les langues isolément ou est-ce qu'on permet donc français d'un côté, puis l'anglais, puis éventuellement le créole, par exemple, ou est-ce qu'on est d'accord pour dire, comme dans la vie réelle, qu'on peut à la fois faire du français et parler en créole, faire de l'anglais et parler en créole. C'est une vraie question. C'est une question, évidemment, qui, pour certains, pour les partisans de la dialectique du pluralisme de la pluralité des langues, devrait être profitable. Pour ma part, je suis un peu plus réservé, mais on va en parler. Et j'arrive justement à la troisième et dernière partie de la discussion, qui sont ce que l'on peut appeler justement les pending issues. Je dirais ces questions qui sont en suspens sont aussi, donc je dirais, Jeff a montré qu'il y avait un débat qui est un débat effectivement qu'on n'a pas forcément à importer, qui est même un peu choquant, on doit dire, autour des linguistes qui seraient racisés ou des chercheurs racisés et non racisés. Dieu merci, enfin, pour ceux qui sont voisins, nous n'avons pas ce débat en France pour l'instant, du moins, même si chez les cléolistes, il y a un débat entre linguistes natifs et linguistes non natifs, mais il demeure que nous avons également beaucoup de questions qui sont à la fois idéologiques et sociopolitiques. Je voudrais en citer juste deux pour conclure, pour montrer qu'effectivement, à la fois nous sommes dans des thématiques proches et en même temps différents dans l'espace francophone. La question du nom des langues et la question, par exemple, pour la République française, d'une politique à l'égard de ces territoires d'outre-mer, d'une politique linguistique pour l'outre-mer. La question de la nomination des langues est très difficile. puisque par exemple, puisque je m'intéresse aux langues créoles, les langues créoles sont des langues régionales en France, elles ont le même statut que le basque, ou le même statut que l'occitan, sauf que, pour ce qui est de la France évidemment, le créole est certainement davantage parlé que le basque, beaucoup plus vivant, donc recevant le traitement ayant le statut de langue régionale pose un problème. Se pose un autre problème qui est la question de comment on nomme ces langues, parce que est-ce que créole est véritablement, étant donné toute la péjoration associée au mot créole, est-ce que c'est comme ça que l'on doit le nommer? D'ailleurs en France on a eu, je ne l'étends pas, mais il y a un conflit toujours autour du CAPES créole, parce qu'on ne sait pas de quel créole il s'agit, et dans combien de créoles on va évaluer les gens. Il y a un sac de nœuds autour de cette question. Mais j'ajoute que la question se pose aussi pour d'autres territoires français, comme la Guyane ou la Nouvelle-Calédonie, parce qu'on voit bien qu'autour de la nomination des langues kanak, de la nomination des langues guyanaises, il y a là des problèmes, et les collègues qui sont ici le savent beaucoup mieux que moi. Donc la question du naming des langues est une question aussi très complexe, et je dirais très douloureuse même. Je ne sais pas si elle est plus douloureuse que la question de savoir si on doit dire Ebonics ou Black ou Afro-American ou je ne sais quoi, mais en tout cas, effectivement, la question de la nomination des langues est une question difficile pour les locuteurs, pour les sociétés et aussi pour les sociétés post-coloniales. C'était l'objet de mon petit topo ailleurs, parce que nommer une langue, c'est non seulement nommer la langue, mais c'est aussi nommer les locuteurs de ces langues, et quelquefois ça peut être un objet de conflit, si le locuteur en question sont même minoritaires. Donc la question de la minorisation linguistique est un vrai problème. Le deuxième problème, et je m'arrête, qui était suscité par le brillant exposé de tout à l'heure, c'est la question des curricula dans les sociétés post-coloniales, et notamment, pour nous qui enseignons le français langue étrangère, la question de la place du français dans les pays multilingues. Cette place est toujours très délicate et elle est complexe, et en plus arrivent des questions qui n'ont pas été traitées ici, qui sont des questions par exemple des normes, etc. Alors, je m'arrête là. Pour ma part, nous avons, je dirais, dans le monde francophone, nous avons fait sans le translingualisme pendant très longtemps. Maintenant, il y a des collègues qui aiment bien ce terme parce que c'est à la mode. Nous avons fait sans, mais j'ai essayé de vous montrer comment nous avons pensé sans et quels sont les problèmes cependant qui restent. Donc on peut se débarrasser du mot, mais les problèmes demeurent. Merci.
Des questions de la salle? Oui.
Thank you. This is more comment than a question, and it maybe builds on the last commentary, and that is that it seems to me that Garcia notion of translanguaging, which was based on the Welsh notion of translanguaging, was rooted initially in educational issues, and that it has transformed into a discussion about language representation, among other things. But in that transformation, it's moved a long way from, I think, issues of teaching and learning, which is one of the sub-themes of the conference. And so I'm just throwing out the issue is that in moving forward, how do we see and I think that Garcia deserves a lot of credit for actually opening up discussion about how languages are used with either bilingual learners or in bilingual contexts of schooling, which is the domain that I work in. And so putting my bilingual education hat on, or putting my hat on that represents English children trying to become bilingual, how do we transform this discussion about translanguaging into a discussion about how languages are used to improve their education and to improve their chances of becoming bilingual? Because that's a real issue. And at the moment, and I think Canada contributed a lot to this, we did keep the languages separate, even in bilingual programs. So I think Garcia deserves a lot of credit for opening up that discussion, and yet the discussion has really gone in a direction that at the moment, it seems to me, forecloses discussion of educational issues. But I think we need to come back to that. We don't need to throw out this other discussion, but I do think it would be useful for educators to hear what scholars think about what is the best way to use languages, where you've got either both bilingual learners or bilingual context, because that's a real issue for teachers and for policymakers. And in pursuing that aspect of translanguage, which I would prefer to ditch as a term and just talk about cross-linguistic issues, I think we could actually uncover some of the depth of how languages are related to one another, either neurocognitively or sociolinguistically. But we've gone so far away from that, I fear we're in the clouds at the moment.
Yeah, I agree, Fred. I didn't take the time to say that during my talk, but I think Ophelia made a very powerful contribution by giving a space to talk about bilingual teaching and learning, which had really, because of all the policy shenanigans that were ongoing in the United States that were directed at, suppressing bilingual teaching during the Bush administration and subsequently, people had sort of stopped talking about that, and Ophelia kind of created space for people to talk again about bilingual pedagogy. And I think that was a wonderful and very impactful thing. And I completely agree with your statement that this bit about the language theory kind of became a distraction, and it's unfortunate. And as I said in my opening remarks, code switching is now kind of a wedge issue. I literally have people come up to me at conferences saying, "Are you about code switching or translanguaging?" Which is so silly. It really is, and it's just unfortunate. We shouldn't, we're not involved in organized religion here. We're scholars, we're researchers. We shouldn't be engaged in orthodoxy, and so there's that kind of sense, unfortunately, around some of the translanguaging stuff that there's a certain orthodoxy, and I think that's been a disservice. And I would love to see talk of translanguaging that's really just about the teaching and learning and the pedagogical part of it, and the conceptual framework, which is also so valuable, right? We don't want teachers to look at languages through the lens of standard language ideology, which is common and typical. And I think many times when people talk about named languages, they're thinking of that through the lens of standard language ideology. And of course, those of us in this room never mean that. When we say Spanish, we're not talking about the Spanish that's been sort of blessed by the academy. We're talking about something else that's diverse. So.
Merci beaucoup. Une dernière question peut-être?
Maybe I can speak up.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I have to say there's a part of your presentation that triggered something quite emotional for me. It was the part where you were talking about the children's civil rights and the importance of identifying their proficiency in English. And for me, this is a very complex, deep, and potentially very problematic issue, because oftentimes the way we identify students' proficiency in English in Canada and in the United States is by giving them a form upon enrollment at school that says, what's your first language, or what's your native language, or what's your home language. And that methodology is very problematic because it is very simplistic, and it doesn't allow you to list the complexities of a plurilingual or a multilingual repertoire, and explain that, for example, maybe you don't have a first language, a single first language, maybe you're going up bilingually, multilingually, and so on and so forth. And so what happens very often in the United States and in Canada, when you answer truthfully to those questions and say, well, my child's first language is, let's say, Bulgarian, in my case, or Chinese or something, those labels can have very powerful consequences for those children's lives. And so somehow, and you know, the label of English language learner comes up, the label of English as a second language comes up, and then that label can be stigmatizing, and you might have to carry it with yourself throughout your primary, secondary school, throughout life. You may not end up in college because of that, right? And so there's actually quite a few parents who lie on those forms because they're hesitant to acknowledge that their children are bilingual or multilingual. And so, yeah, I guess I want you to address that a little bit from this perspective of competing ideologies and competing terminologies. And I feel like, I feel like the existing labels that we have and we use, they're kind of unavoidable. Like you mentioned, we have to mention languages, otherwise there's a lot of problematic consequences there. But I do want to acknowledge the power of deconstructing some of those labels, sometimes in order for us to get insights and move forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I totally agree. It's a very problematic process, and I've actually written about this in the past, particularly with regard to the tests that are used. So in the United States, I think it's probably quite similar to what you do in Canada. A parent fills out a form when the child's enrolled and is asked, is there a language other than English spoken at home? And yes, what is that language? And that triggers then a language assessment. And the assessments are terrible. They're absolutely terrible. And in the United States, we've gone through sort of two generations of tests. There was one before the No Child Left Behind law, which was passed in approximately 2000. And then there was a generation of tests following it. Both are terrible, primarily because they tend to blend conceptions of academic achievement with language. And so a child who maybe doesn't do well academically but speaks English well may be identified as an English language learner by such a test quite incorrectly. We had that, it was quite common with Navajo speakers in Arizona. They were, even though they would say, yes, Navajo is spoken at home, meaning grandmother comes to visit sometimes and speaks Navajo, but they didn't know Navajo at all. And then because the tests were so bad, they were assessed as, English language learners, even though they only knew English, And so that is a very problematic thing, and we really need to interrogate it and figure it out. So I definitely agree with that critical stance on that process. On the other hand, I wouldn't say, and I don't think you're suggesting this, I wouldn't say we want to just throw out the whole problem and say, well, let's not worry about identifying kids, because that's going to create space for some school systems then to completely neglect to protect children who will not understand instruction, and that'll be a throwback, to the 60s and before, when immigrant kids, really, you could just take for granted if you didn't know English, you were not going to get an education. That's how it was before 1974. After 1974, in the United States, schools were legally obliged to meet the needs of kids who didn't understand the language of instruction. And so how exactly that is done needs to be interrogated and figured out in a way so it's a positive experience for everybody. And I think, sorry Natalie, I think using terms like multilingual learner rather than English language learner is a positive step, because that's more strength-based, rather than labeling the kid as an ESL student, oh, that's a bilingual kid, that's a multilingual kid. And in many states in the United States, we've tried to have these seals of biliteracy, where we make it an option for anybody to be able to demonstrate that they're bilingual, and that then gets marked on a child's transcript. And that too has problems. But these are all steps we can take to try to remove the stigma from those kids who come into those schools.
Many thanks.